In this presentation, we're going to look at ethics, property rights, and the property practitioner. Our purpose is to look at the foundations of moral thought and ethics and examine the connections between those and the whole notion of property rights. And that leads into an understanding of property law and also appropriate behaviour for property practitioners. The first thing we can say about morals is that everyone thinks that they are moral. It's basically a condition of being a human person. We can define a human person or a human being as a person who has intellect and will. The importance of having will means that we get to choose the way we behave. This brings us a little different to dogs and cats and things. And it assumes this notion of freedom, of free will. And to have freedom in our actions means that we must assume that we have the power to do something apart from what we choose to do at any particular time. This means that in having this choice, we get to think through and decide how it is that we are going to relate to other people. We're going to be seeing later on that humans are social animals, and so we're always looking for ways of relating to other people. And this gives us our definition for what a moral is. Fundamentally, a moral is a principle for appropriate relations between persons. This is an important definition to learn and to give some thought to, because it gives a very different spin on the nature of what morality is all about than what is often considered around general community. While we're doing our definitions, we'll look at also what an ethic is. An ethic, strictly speaking, is no more than a set of morals. And so if we're speaking about ethics, we're speaking about sets of ethics, sets of appropriate principles for relations between persons. Now, in an environment of freedom, especially with people who are able to think through and make decisions about what they choose to do, there is no question of compulsion. In fact, we will find that where compulsion exists, there can be no actual moral action. And this is because although moral action requires some kind of an output, a result, which in some way is appropriate to the recipient, where there is compulsion, what it means is that result, that impact on the other, has really very little to do with the moral actor, because in the absence of freedom, the moral actor doesn't actually have any moral merit. We can look at the example of perhaps somebody in prison. They might be forced through their situation to act in a particular way. A murderous person in prison may be prevented forcibly from committing murder, even though in his heart he might really want to. Is the person moral because they're not murdering while they're in prison? Hardly. Their intention is still murderous, but they're prevented from it. Likewise, if somebody, through some overwhelming compulsion, is forced to do some evil deed, we can stand back from condemning that person as evil, and because we can see that the level of compulsion, one way or another, diminished their moral culpability. If morals have to do with freely choosing, the ultimate issue with moral philosophy, moral consideration, is the question of motivation. Why is it that people act in a particular way? What can incline them to make healthy and useful decisions, appropriate decisions, that one way or another will lead to some good outcome from others? We've said that morality has to do with appropriate relations between persons. And this notion of appropriateness means that if we live in an environment where we're dealing with moral people, people who treat others appropriately, we can enjoy a certain level of trust. The advantages of living in such a community is that it gives a number of benefits that we describe as civilized. In a civilized environment, we can be confident, we can trust that the other will treat us appropriately. And it's been found that living in civilized environments has numerous advantages. We can sleep easier, so there's less psychological anxiety. We find that they're economically more productive. And historically, the more civilized a society is, the better the quality of life for the people who inhabit it. But from what we've said, civilization contains a curious paradox. Civilization is built on trust. We can't build civilization on a compulsion or a set of compulsions. One way or another, the members of a civilization, its citizens, must be able to motivate themselves ultimately to freely choose to act in a way which is appropriate to those around them. And this personal free decision to choose in a way that helps those around them necessarily means that the civilized person practices self-restraint. That self-restraint is directed one way or another for the good of the other in relationship, or at least some level of neutrality. It certainly doesn't use one's power, one's ability to do otherwise, in other words, act immorally, for the good primarily of the self, at the expense of the other. And so this option to freely choose to do good for another and certainly not to exploit them is the hallmark of civilization. And living in that environment, it means that one doesn't have to exercise the same level of caution and self-defense that one does in a chaotic or a jungle-like environment. Now, if a person is able to choose their actions, genuinely choose it, and yet they make a choice which is motivated to act responsibly and appropriately with those others, what it means is that they have the power to do otherwise. If a person chooses to tell the truth, it necessarily means that they must have a situation existing where it's possible for them to tell a lie and get away with it, and likewise to do violence or to rob somebody. They must choose to treat the other fairly, to speak honestly and so on, or to not steal from them or do violence to them. What this means is that in relationship, when a person treats another person morally or appropriately, the justice of their action is actually, in one sense, a gift to the other person. Let's look at this another way. If I have the power to steal from you in a way which you have no defense to stop me, it means that I have a potential power over you. However, if I have been brought up in a way where I choose not to use that power to steal from you, to exploit you, then my action in treating you honestly is a form of gift to you. It's something that I give you because I don't have to give it to you. I might be able to steal from you in such a way, maybe through banking fraud or something, where you may not even know that you're being stolen from, and I might be able to get away scot-free. However, I choose not to. This whole notion of gift is rather curious. It's more evident in ancient cultures, and certainly it's quite apparent in indigenous cultures. However, for the Western mind, the idea of relationship as built on gift has become rather foreign. There is yet another curiosity with this notion of civilization. Most people find it desirable to live in a civilized environment. However, living in a civilized environment one way or another means contributing to it through freely choosing to act in a way which is appropriate to those around you. And while this is most desirable, the cost of having to act in an appropriate way actually becomes a psychological stress. And the reason for this is that if civilization is defined as a community of persons who freely choose self-restraint to act for the good of the other, or at least appropriately with the other, for those people who recognize that they have a power to do otherwise, let's say the power to steal from other people in a civilized environment, those people can see that, yes, they have the power to steal, and yes, their civilized environment is quite productive and trusting, and therefore theft is very easy in a trusting environment, in a world where nobody expects a thief. It is probably the easiest place for a thief to operate. And so what this suggests is that civilization attracts a person who wants to be the only dishonest person or the only immoral person in that environment. And so the very nature of civilization itself attracts immorality, or at least heightens the temptation, if you like, to step away from treating other people appropriately. And so we have this problem lurking at the root of all our moral thought. That while we can talk colourfully about all of the advantages of living in civilization, the person who definitely benefits most from a civilized situation is the rogue, the one person who decides not to follow the rules. And because they're able to not follow the rules in an environment of a high level of trust, they're probably going to be able to succeed with that relatively successfully for a fairly long time. The problem here is obvious. The most successful person in a civilized situation is likely to be the only rogue, the only person who is not really treating other people appropriately. They will become rich and powerful. There are other ways to become rich and powerful, of course, but this fast track through acting immorally is certainly there, and it's a core problem with any civilized situation. And unfortunately, if the rogue is particularly effective at disguising their immorality and perhaps applies some of the resources that they've gained inappropriately to methods of disguising their immorality even further, what can happen is that not only do you have immoral outrunners in society, basically, to use the common expression, ripping it off, but they will one way or another become the exemplars, the leaders who others want to follow. This then causes the decay of the civilization as a larger and larger percentage of people start to follow and copy the rogues, of course, leading to a demise of trust and ultimately the collapse of the civilization. And we can see this written in the history of past civilizations more than once. This problem of morals, then, is quite important because it has to do with nothing less than the maintenance of civilization itself. The difficulty is finding these moral principles, these principles for appropriate relations between persons. For most people, their first introduction to appropriate dealings with others comes as a result of their experience within family. After that comes their experience with dealing with other people in society, their friends and so on, perhaps people at school in our culture. Another source of morals is commonly religion. We find that virtually every society has some kind of a religious background, at least as its origin, and each religion supplies a moral code to its followers. A third source of morals is science, especially the sciences of philosophy and sociology. Amongst all of these varied sources, the moral actor ultimately has to make decisions for themselves. They have to decide freely which principles are in fact valid principles for relations between persons. And so some of them may come from family or friends. However, people may have had unfortunate experiences in their family life or amongst their friends, which unfortunately twist their approach to the validity of morals from that source. Likewise with religion. And then comes the problems with using philosophy or sociology as a source for our understanding of how to deal others. We find that through history there have been many, many philosophies of morals, and we need to get back to find what tools coming from moral philosophy, that science of appropriate relations between persons, that are in fact robust and useful to help us read through which are in fact the reliable principles and which aren't. And this leads us to the question of tests of veracity, tests of which moral principles are in fact valid and which ones are defective, which ones are worth us following and taking on in our own life, and which ones are in fact a little bit silly or worse. To explore this question of the veracity of moral principles, we'll begin by looking at some common misconceptions. The first is that morals change over time. This is often defended by looking at the fact that different cultures follow different ethics, and that somehow ethics differ between cultures. A third misconception is that morals originate or come from religion, as though the different gods of the different religions all work out their own set of appropriate relations pretty much off their own bat. Another misconception is that morals or moral activity makes life dull. And finally, there is the view that morals are what the dominant powers use to subject us. While these views are all very common, it's important to look at the reality behind them. First of all, while morals change over time, or at least the moral practices of people do change over time, what we can say more precisely is that cultures change over time. However, in some ways, when we look back over history, and we will be shortly, we can see that while the cultural practices and the moral beliefs of people, perhaps the moral opinions of people, change, the actual quality of the underlying moral principles do not change. And we can see this from the very simple fact that we can stand back and say that some moral systems are better than others. How is it that we can say better? Surely the only way that we can compare two different moral systems, say the moral system that currently reigns in our country compared to that which was in existence 50 years ago, is to have some external reference point, some scale, some standard by which we can say that the moral systems of cultures or times are actually performing. We can look, for instance, at the question of slavery. At different times in history, the Romans and the Greeks, and in fact even the British, at different times were very comfortable with slavery. And now we live in a world where slavery is considered to be an immoral practice. So we can say that morals change over time. But the reality is that the evil of slavery is something that has not changed. It's simply that the moral opinions of the ancient Greeks and the Romans, and perhaps the British of the early 19th century, actually represented a poor manifestation of what is an unchanging moral view, and that is that the ownership by one person of another is something which is abhorrent, which in one way or another is evil. And so what we can say is that while the opinions of people change over time with respect to what is morally valid, the underlying standards may not. Likewise with the question of morals coming from religion. It is certainly the truth that religions do all carry with themselves their own particular ethics, However, this is not to say that ethics or ethical principles, moral principles, come from religion, especially when we can see that there are many, many different religions, many with various collections of moral principles. And one way or another, we're able to judge to a certain extent the quality of a religion by the quality of its ethic. And again, this comes back to this notion that once we say that we can test a religion by the quality of its ethical practice, then we're assuming that there is some external standard, some standard which is above religion or behind religion, that can say, yes, this or that religion is better than this or that other religion, and therefore it's probably more likely to be worth following. What that would suggest is that ethics is one way or another independent of religion, even though a religious position might supply a quite valid ethical set. When we look at the question of morals making life dull, it's probably more correct to say that vice makes life more risky. We've seen that civilization makes life considerably more pleasant and enjoyable. And so if civilization is built on moral actors, moral citizens, then it's difficult to see how being moral one way or another makes life dull, unless you consider that the exciting life is to live in a jungle where you can't trust anybody. And lastly, this unfortunate view that morality is no more than what the dominant powers use to subject us, which incidentally is traced back to Marx and the socialist perspective that he originated. What we can see is that rather than being a tool for oppression or subjugation, morality is actually based ultimately and completely on the notion of freedom. And so morals permit civilization, and they permit an environment of greater freedom. And so it's hard to square that idea with the notion that in fact they're some kind of subtle way of oppressing us. Let's look now at the way that it's very easy to see defective moral systems. In fact, a surprising amount of our conversation is actually concerned with this whole notion of observing and shying away from, hopefully, what we see as the defective moral principles of those around us. It's easy to see, for instance, that Hitler was a champion of a moral system that was really quite defective. When we look back in history, we can look at situations such as slavery that we've mentioned, but also the phenomenon of cannibalism. Also today, we generally have quite an abhorrence of pedophilia. Likewise, the traditional practices in some cultures of genital mutilation, especially of young women, is considered to be something totally abhorrent and inappropriate. And even though these things might be considered as quite acceptable within a particular culture or a particular time, when we stand back and look at it, we would say, how could they ever have done that? Because it is so wrong. When we take this position, when we engage in some kind of discussion over appropriate principles for our relations with others, what we are doing is recognizing, at least implicitly, that there is some external standard that is able to be applied to test whether one approach to relationship is better than another. What this means is that there must be some scale to measure the quality of morals. This is a bit like the way that if we look at two objects and say one is hotter than the other, what we're actually inferring is a belief and in fact an acceptance of a external, absolute and unchanging scale of temperature or standard of temperature that we might call the Fahrenheit scale or the Celsius scale, that one way or another isn't influenced by the hotness or the coldness of one item or another, but stands outside of particular situations of heat or coldness and gives us this external reference point. And this is really what we're inferring when we say that Hitler's Germany was in some way less appropriate a civilization or a set of beliefs leading to civilization than, say, what currently holds in Australia. There's a problem, however, and the problem is often rather delicately referred to as the problem of human frailty. Human frailty refers to our unfortunate inclination to be generally good people, but to have an inclination towards wanting to use our power for our own benefit, not with other people, but at their expense. And so we want a moral system ultimately to suit our needs that gives us a little bit of a bigger share of the pie, so to speak. This suggests that the particular system of morals that we happen to be living under may not be totally to our liking, because we would prefer to be able to muck up from time to time. To understand the psychology of this, we need to look at really what we've established. If we accept that one way or another our ability to see defective moral systems means that we do at least implicitly have an idea, a lurking belief that there is an unchanging moral reference system behind which all of our particular moral systems tend to work. And so we can test particular moral systems, such as that of Hitler or the cannibals or whoever, against these unchanging moral standards. However, while those particular moral standards bear down on us in our particular social situation and give us standards that we're expected to follow, our inclinations when we want to muck up, or at least those of us who do particularly want to buck at a particular system, means that there is a certain level of rebellious tendency that seems to be quite a common feature of the human condition. And so while ideally we make a personal decision to accept a particular moral system, the fact that our inclination is to want more than our share or to be able to use our power to abuse others means that we are equally likely to rebel against the particular moral system which might be dominant for our culture or civilization. It's actually at this moment of wishing to rebel that we experience a rather peculiar psychological phenomenon. This phenomenon is known as the problem of psychological or cognitive dissonance. If I want to go and rob a bank, for argument's sake, I might be inclined and in fact attracted by all the benefits that robbing the bank will bring me. However, I'm aware that I live in a moral climate that says that bank robbing is in fact an act of vice. Cognitive dissonance would say that living in that environment, knowing that I want to do something which the moral system says is evil, means that if I go out and rob the bank, I'll be living some kind of a contradiction. I want to think of myself as a moral creature, and yet I've robbed the bank, and they tell me that robbing banks is an immoral thing to do, an act of vice. My easy response is to say that, well, this particular moral system isn't a very good one. It doesn't conform to the ideals of moral order. In fact, I think that it might be better if people were occasionally allowed to rob banks, or at least that, in my case, I have a special dispensation to be allowed to do it. Now, all of these responses have their difficulties. A common response is to say that the moral system totally is wrong. But to give myself the maximum flexibility, the more common strategy has been, at least in recent times, to say that this notion of there being an unchanging moral system that one way or another my civilization has attempted to embody is a bit of a myth. And in fact, there is no unchanging moral system or reference point. It just happens that the moral environment that I live in is an arbitrary set of rules that are right now cramping my style, preventing me from being able to express myself and my bank robbing inclinations. If I'm successful at being able to do this, to destroy the belief in moral reference points, then I'm able to refashion the moral system with which I believe. And this means that I then get rid of this problem of cognitive dissonance. I have been able to reform the moral order because it's no longer controlled or directed by an external and unchanging moral standard into something that I have more control over. And by being able to control it, I'm therefore able to have a moral system that conforms to my own preferences. The delightful thing here is that I go from being a vicious person who robs banks to, in fact, a moral exemplar in a world where the morality of robbing banks is, in fact, really quite positive. I can look to history to see whether this possibility of there being a reference system that I can apply to morals, in fact, actually makes sense. And what I can see is that history shows us many, many moral systems. And we can say that all of them have at least some merit. Some of them have in fact led to great civilizations, but unfortunately others have caused the destruction of similarly great civilizations. As well, all the systems that we can look through in history all have their critics. Some of the critics are offended by their errors, while other critics are offended by their goodness. One way or another, we can see that humanity spends a considerable amount of effort discussing the quality of various moral systems. And the very fact that we have this dialogue through time, and in fact all of us involve ourselves in it with a fair bit of our time. You just think back to when you've spoken to somebody about what they should or shouldn't have done, or when we talk about some situation and we might talk about a third party as being right or wrong or whatever, or simply not behaving appropriately. What we're doing is judging these other events, whether historical or other people around us, by some sort of a moral standard. And we at least have the confidence that there is such a thing as a moral standard that stands outside of the particular instances. Moreover, we can see that history does grade moral systems. The rise and fall of Greece and Rome are examples of moral systems that have caused great civilizations to develop, but when those civilizations have changed their moral systems, they've gone to something else. Likewise, when we look back on the history of Nazi Germany, generally most commentators today are unanimous that what Hitler did to the Germans was to convince them of a moral system that in some way was not right. Now, this is not merely to say that it's not right according to modern Western civilizations coming from the United States and the English-speaking world. It is really to say that, in our opinion, there is something that all countries must follow, and one way or another, Nazi Germany didn't. The general lessons we have from this is that those moral systems that are objective, in other words, they're based on the idea that morals are found and not made, tend to outperform the subjective ones, those that say that it's the moral actor who gets to work out for themselves what is moral or immoral. Likewise, the systems that focus on clan and family alignments, what we can call solidarity, tend to outperform those that focus on the individual. We can certainly see that in the contrast between the Greek customary values that brought to bear the greatest civilization of antiquity, how it was focused ultimately on the alignment of the individual as part of a clan, whereas that same great culture tended to disintegrate when it changed its moral system to focus on the individual as being able to care for themselves. Likewise, we can see that universal moral systems tend to outperform parochial ones. And by this we mean that while tribal customs and ethical systems tend to work very well inside the tribe, they're not especially good at organising larger organisations of people. We can see this in a number of countries that are made up of what are still largely smaller tribal groups, whether this be in parts of the South Pacific or perhaps in Africa. One of the great innovations of the Mediterranean world was the discovery or the development of ways of organising society that were based on the universal dignity of humanity. And this is the position that all humans, regardless of what family or tribe or culture they belong to, are all fundamentally human persons and should be treated equally as moral persons. The last general lesson from history is that inner motivation outperforms external. If you have a community of persons where everyone is motivated because they align themselves with the moral system of their culture, that inner motivation, that free will decision to act according to the laws and customs of their people, tends to outperform those that rely more heavily on external compulsion, whether it be external compulsion of the state, such as in communism, or external compulsion of something else. By and large, when you see a culture that is relying more and more on a proliferation of laws and regulatory systems, you are seeing a culture which is losing its moral spirit, because the members of that civilization, that culture, that community, are no longer moving through their inner motivation. Aristotle said that a just law does not constrain an ethical person. And by this, Aristotle was recognizing that if you have a solid community of persons who are motivated to act morally, their actions are not constrained by those morals or by the laws of the land. For instance, I doubt if you feel constrained by the law in Australia that prohibits murder, because most probably you don't feel inclined to murder people, at least very often. And so that moral restriction that is embodied in the law of the land does not actually restrict your behaviour at all. In fact, it gives you a certain level of freedom, because it means you can walk out after dark and so on, knowing that that very small number of people in the community who are inclined to do violence to others, one way or another, are being constrained. However, if it was the case that most people in the community wanted to do violence to others, one way or another you would find that regardless of how many laws we passed or how strong we made the police force, the likelihood towards murder would still be considerably greater. We can see this perhaps in the contrast between the situations in North America between the United States of America and Canada. It appears that there are considerably more guns per head of population in Canada than there are in the United States. However, the rate of murder in Canada is almost zero. Certainly it's a very rare thing, whereas the rate is well known in the United States to be quite high. Does this mean that guns are causing murder in North America? Well, in fact, it means just the opposite. It means regardless of what gun laws and restrictions a country might bring to bear, if the people in it are motivated away from doing violence to others, such as the Canadians appear to be, regardless of whether they have guns or not, they freely choose not to use them. And this example of the gun situation and murder in the North American countries is a good indication of the way that morals work, that it comes down to this inner motivation. Accepting the idea that there may exist an external standard by which particular moral systems can be judged does not bring us very much closer to identifying what it actually is and how we can populate its standards. In the previous slide, we've seen some general commonalities of good moral systems or effective moral systems compared to poor ones, at least in terms of their capacity to support a civilization. But to dig deeper into being able to understand those systems and their dynamics, we need to actually move out of moral philosophy into another branch of philosophy. And that is the branch known as metaphysics. Metaphysics is that branch of science that has to do with the study of existence. Formally defined, metaphysics is the study of what is fit to be, what is fit to exist, how things exist. While this sounds like very obscure philosophy to many people, it actually comes down to a very simple idea. When I have a simple sentence which includes the verb to be, I'm very likely to be looking at a metaphysical statement, because a statement that talks about the way that a thing exists, the way it is a description of some characteristic of what a thing must be in order to be what it is. Unfortunately, it takes a little while to untangle the ideas of metaphysics. And curiously, the reason that it's so difficult to see is because it's so close to us. I'll use an example. We can say that a house is a physical shelter conformed for people to live within. While that might be a little bit of a highfalutin definition, it comes down to a statement of what characteristics, what properties a house must have in order for it to be called a house. If I have something which is too small or too big or too well ventilated to afford shelter, I could say that I'm having something which is either not a house at all or perhaps not a very good house. And so this understanding of what it is to be a house has to do with what characteristics a thing must have in order to deserve that name. Science is made up of large collections of these statements. And for instance, when we, in school, go into a science class, we might be told that carbon dioxide is a colourless, odourless gas. What we're being told is some of the characteristics which a thing must have in order to be carbon dioxide. We might be told, say, that common salt is sodium chloride. And what that means is, for something to be common salt, it must be a compound of sodium and chlorine. If it was a compound of something else, it might be a salt, but it wouldn't be common salt. What's happening here is that we're being told those things, those properties, those things which salt must have, common salt must have, in order to be salt. One way or another, science is all about exploring what properties things have and in what way they're connected, how one causes another. And so we can interpret a science text as really a collection of metaphysical statements about things, about what things are, what they have to be in order to be themselves, and also how they relate. While we're looking at the question of science, we can give you the definition of science, because science is certain knowledge through cause. And science is always about understanding things and their relationships, how they are brought into being, and what things follow from them. And so, for instance, when we look at the whole notion of physics, we're looking at the way that forces interact with masses and cause motion. And so it's the causality of motion and perhaps the changing properties of things that we can see in physics and chemistry and the other sciences. One way or another, if a body of knowledge doesn't have to do with leading someone to a better understanding of what really is and what causal relations exist between things, that body of ideas might be interesting, but it's certainly not a science. It might be in the area of political influence or political rhetoric, or it might be poetry or something, but it's not science. Science must be certain knowledge through cause. This notion of causality is another area of metaphysics. And in fact, metaphysics takes a lot of interest in causality. What happens? What are the factors that bring a thing into existence? If we look at our house, for instance, what we can say is that the house, one way or another, wouldn't be a house if it wasn't for the building materials that comprise it. And so we can say that the matter of the house, or what's formally referred to as its material cause, are the raw materials that make it up. Quite simply, if you didn't have the raw materials, you wouldn't have a house. However, a house is more than a pile of building materials. It's a pile of building materials which has been put into a particular set of relationships, a particular order, a particular shape or design. We call the ordering of matter that makes a thing what it is its formal cause. And so the architect, before the house is built, will have worked out how to stick the building materials together in a particular way to make it into a shape which is conformed for people to live within, hopefully with a little bit of aesthetic as well. The building materials don't order themselves, don't jump up and get themselves sorted out and to form a house by themselves. While the thing that we see is an ordered set of building materials that has the form of house, but the materials of bricks and steel and so on, it takes an external force, a mover, the builder, to actually cause the building materials to adopt the form or the order of house. This external builder, the maker, is known in philosophy as the efficient cause. So the efficient cause is this external agency, this external force, which is able to put the form into the matter. Between these three, we can really account for just about everything we see when we observe a house. We can certainly recognise the building materials. We can enjoy the aesthetics of the design or the form. And unless you're particularly silly, you will be able to stand back and say, well, somebody must have built that. It didn't sort of fall out of the sky like that by accident. However, this doesn't fully explain the existence of the house. And this is because builders will seldom run around the place taking lumps of building materials and turning them into houses, unless there's some reason to go and do it, either to provide shelter for themselves or shelter for somebody else. And it's this need for shelter that one way or another is the ultimate cause for the house. It's the final cause. It's the cause that motivates all of the other causes to actually get their act together and do something to shape the thing into the house. This final cause, this desire, this need, is known as the final cause. It's the purpose or reason. And one way or another, all things that exist are the result of some need or desire, some push. When we look at a volcano, for instance, we're seeing something which is the result of a push from within the earth. The pressure built up under the surface of the earth is so great that it needs an exit, and that exit turns into the escaping material which becomes the volcano. And so even inanimate things can be seen to have a final cause, a purpose or a reason for existence. While all of these four causes are very important when we're looking at the stuff of property economics, for our purposes at the moment, we're going to look particularly at the question of form. Form, or as it's sometimes known as essence or nature, is a curious thing. It's what we see somehow when we look at a thing. However, strictly speaking, we don't see it, but we know it. When I look at what I call a house, I actually see windows and walls and roof and door and so on. I call it a house because I'm familiar with that design, that particular ordering, and whether the house is made out of stone or straw or tin or whatever, I still identify it as a house regardless of its building materials. And the reason is that the essence, the form, the shape, the design, is something which is actually outside of the materials that the thing is made from. I can look at something and call it a chair. It might be made of concrete or stone or plastic or whatever, but it still will be called a chair. This tells me that form is actually outside of matter. Curiously, the form of a house, or a particular house, existed before the house actually existed at all. This is because it existed in the mind of the architect. Somehow the form existed quite completely and perfectly in the mind of the architect. And so, while the form exists outside of the building materials, even though I somehow see it, it also exists even if the house wasn't actually built. I might see a drawing of a house, or an architect might tell me about the design for a house that he intends to build. This tells me that the form exists before the actual concrete house, the physical house. This means that I know it even before I see it or touch it or feel it, because it exists in the realm of ideas. And likewise, after the house has been destroyed, I can still talk about the house and remember the house, even though I may not have photos or models or anything of the house. The form, you see, endures. It exists before the physical house, and exists in a sense even after the physical house is gone. It's easy for us to say that, well, therefore, form exists in the mind of humanity. And certainly to a certain extent it does. But it even goes further than that. We can talk about the way that, let's say, go back to the very beginning of the universe, at what we currently believe to be the Big Bang. At that point, there was an explosion of some sort that sent matter out in all directions. And then it was only after a period of time that that matter coalesced and condensed into atoms, and eventually these congealed into lumps of material that became stars and planets and so on. Now, we're all familiar with that story, but the fact of being able to even just tell that story means that the idea of atoms, planets and stars, we can conceptualize at least as existing well before the Big Bang. And in fact, the atoms and planets and so on that the matter of the Big Bang coalesced into were in fact potentially possible even before the Big Bang happened. We can easily imagine that had the Big Bang happened, let's say, 1 billion years before it actually did, the same things would have happened. The same forms were potentially available, even though they weren't actually manifest in the matter of the universe. If we give some thought to this, what we can conclude is that form is something that exists quite independent of existence of any sort, at least material existence of any sort. The house exists before and after the physical house exists, but it even exists, conceivably, before humanity itself existed. Form in some way, therefore, not only is outside matter, but it's outside of change. And in a sense, forms do not change. What do I mean by this? I mean that if I'm looking at a house, and I say, well, a house is only a house because I call it a house, that's not strictly correct. What's happening is that I'm looking at something which is conformed for humans to live in. It's only out of convenience that I call it a house. I could call it an igloo or teepee or something. However, the concept, the idea, is still the same. Well, maybe not igloo, but some other word, hut perhaps. If I say that houses change over time, I can certainly see that the way people build houses has changed over time. We may have at one time made houses more out of timber, and now we tend to make them more out of bricks. We might have made roofs in a particular way out of dead straw or something in times gone by, and now we use tiles or metal. But this is not to say that the idea of house has changed. I can look at a grass hut in some African village and say, there is some family's house. This is because it is sharing in that fundamental property of it being conformed for a human group to live within. If the grass hut was the wrong size or the wrong shape or fell down or something, I wouldn't say, well, the house has simply evolved into a new type of house. I would say the house has now fallen over or been burnt, or maybe it's been turned into a pigsty or something. And I'd call it a dairy or a pigsty. I would no longer call it a house. And the reason is it's no longer evidencing or displaying that property of being conformed for people to live in. I can do similar things with virtually anything. If I look at a motor car, for instance, if I take the engine out and then maybe do something to the windows so that it's a very handy place for my chickens to live in, I'll be not likely to call it a car anymore. It has now become my chicken coop. It would be foolish to say that, in fact, it's simply a changed car, because after all, what is a car but some sort of an automobile, a self-motivated carriage which is suitable for humans to move in? And certainly my chicken coop is well past that. The point here is that forms do not change, even though the particular instances of them do change. In our quest to understand the nature of these ultimate moral standards, this is a very important starting point, because if form does not change, then it gives me the possibility for a stable intellectual framework of relationships between existing things that can give me these standards for appropriate relations between persons, which particular cultural practices may or may not conform to. In fact, this examination of unchanging relationships is what all science is focused on. It's focused on the connections between things, and these connections are as stable as forms are. We move now from the question of existence and metaphysics to the question of how we can know about the outside world. And this technically is the science of epistemology, which is another branch of philosophy. And we need to introduce at least a tiny element of epistemology in order to understand the moral problem. Philosophers have wrestled with the question of whether the outside world exists, and by and large, the conclusion is that while there may be questions we can ask, the reality is that it's rather foolish not to recognise the conclusions that an outside world does exist. But then the question for philosophers changes. Even though an outside world exists, can I actually know it? Can I actually have certain knowledge about it, certain understanding? To answer this question, we have to begin by defining what knowledge is. Knowledge was defined by Plato as justified true belief. The question that was asked is that, well, can I have justified true belief, certain belief, not just an opinion, about the behaviour and nature of existence of the external world? And the problem which comes up is that when I look around me, what I am aware of is the result of my senses. And there are two problems here. The first one is that my senses may be deceiving me. And so they may be bringing in impressions that in some ways are distorted. For instance, if I really need to wear spectacles but I leave them at home, my sensations of the things around me are in fact quite distorted. And so my understanding of what the world looks like might be very, very distorted, very far from reality. The second problem is, what about the things themselves? Do they exist in the way that I think they exist, even though I might look at them? I don't want to go too far into this area. I think we might conclude that objective existence is naively apparent. And it's also philosophically apparent, but we really don't have time to go into this issue. But we do have to recognise that what we observe is not what we think we observe. When I might say to you, I'm looking out my window at a tree, I'm actually not looking at a tree at all. because what comes into my eye, the sensations that my eye sends to my brain, is actually no more than a pattern of colours. And that pattern of colours moves over time, perhaps as the wind moves the leaves in the tree. Somehow I'm able to infer treeness, the existence of the tree, from that stable pattern of colours and shapes and boundaries. What I'm saying here is that my sensations, the colours, tastes, smells, sounds and textures that I might perceive, are coming to me directly as my senses somehow capture some aspect of the matter around them. But from that matter, I then abstract the notion of what that matter represents. And so if I see the green and grey of the tree in the distance, I'm seeing tree, the form of tree. And I know what a tree is. It's a large vegetable that has a stiff trunk and so on. I don't talk about, I'm looking out and seeing a complex pattern of green, grey and brown. I simply say, there's a beautiful tree over there. Likewise, as we've seen in the previous slide, when I look out and say, I noticed a new house was being built on the corner as I came to work, I don't actually see a house at all. I see a collection of building materials. And maybe I might see a collection of building materials which is ordered so that it looks pretty much like a house, just about ready to be occupied. I know the form from the order of the matter. I know the matter simply from the sensations, the colours, the textures and so on that I might perceive. The curiosity about the form is that I don't perceive it directly. My senses cannot see houses or trees. They see hard, soft, wet, cold, bright and the various colours, but they don't see trees and houses. I have to abstract the tree from the sensations, from the order of the matter, and likewise with the house. Aristotle referred to this as the first level of abstraction, and so my direct senses, my direct empirical observations of the world consist of very primitive sensations. However, I'm so familiar with abstracting that to see the forms, and I use the expression see almost metaphorically, that I take it for granted that humans are creatures that do this process of abstraction quite routinely. But it doesn't stop there. After I've abstracted to the level of the forms, I actually abstract at least one level further, and that's into the level of relationships. I might come in and say, it looks like Billy Bloggs' house is just about built. What am I saying there? Not only have I abstracted my recognition of the matter as the house, which is just about finished, but I also understand that it relates to Billy Bloggs in some particular way, and I might talk about the builder. Again, I'm talking about these relationships that exist. I'm comfortable with the fact that the builder is causing the form to be put into the matter. These are relational issues. I don't actually see it directly, but I infer it. Again, we take this quite comfortably and routinely because it's all around us and it's happening all the time. It's a very natural and comfortable, almost primitive aspect of what it is to be human. What it does tell me, though, is that through this level of abstraction and then the secondary abstraction into relationships, using my human intellect, I'm able to understand things that aren't immediately apparent, and things that one way or another have to do with dimensions which are very, very permanent and unchanging. Plato was one of the first to grapple with this question of the forms at some length. And he concluded that the forms exist outside of humanity, outside of material existence, and really outside of time. They're bigger and more permanent than people. One of the other curiosities that's curious because we take it so much for granted is that the world around us is to a certain extent orderly and rational. There aren't any nightmares in our existence. If I have a dream, I might see someone who might suddenly disappear or turn into something else. I might be in the middle of a conversation in a dream and suddenly find that I'm in a different situation, a different room perhaps, or amongst different people. I might find that I'm flying, even though in wakeful life, I know that it's something that I can't do without the help of an aeroplane. But our rational world isn't like that. Trees are trees, and they're always trees. They don't morph into carrots or dogs, unless you're on acid or something. This rationality of the world is something that we take for granted. However, it's very, very important. It's orderly. Another aspect of existence is that it's what we call contingent. Everything that exists in the world around us, the world that we're aware of, is the result of other causes. Nothing has to exist the way that it is. If I look out upon a tree, the tree doesn't have to be there. 1,000 years ago or something, or 100 years ago, the tree probably wasn't there. In a few years into the future, it may not be there either. It's no necessity for it being there, and it is there as a result of conditions in the past, of the seed falling, the climate being correct, the soil being correct, and humans or other animals not coming along and eating it or breaking it or something. And so existence relies on other causes. Another curiosity about existence is that there are various types of objective existence. I can look at the tree and say, well, the tree certainly exists. But I've already been speaking about the notion of the existence of forms. Forms certainly exist. The idea of house is certainly a very real and tangible thing. Tangible in an intellectual way, though. While I can see a house, I can live in a house, I can own a house, I only actually see the building materials. And so the existence of forms is a little bit different. Forms ultimately live in a different world, a world of ideas or concepts or something. The philosopher Plato considered that the forms lived in a far more real world because they lived in a perfected world which was unchanging. We will leave further discussion of that for another time. We've already dealt with the problem of knowledge, and to a certain extent this problem of knowledge has been used to come to some pretty, peculiar conclusions. While we're certainly aware that our senses are not always reliable, what it doesn't mean, though, is our senses are always deceiving us. While I might leave my glasses at home and mix up a tree and think that it's a dog, when I put my spectacles on or I ask somebody or go out and touch the tree, I'm able to confirm one way or another the validity of my sensations. And so we can say that in total senses are reliable, even though particular instances might deceive us. The knowledge that we have comes through more than simply simple sense experience. And we've seen this with the matter of forms and relationships. Importantly, we can talk about objective truths. And this is an important confusion which is closely tied to the problem of morals in the first place. It's a popular misconception today that there is no such thing as objective truth. This is a curious idea, because even to think it is to be a party to a paradox. Is it true that there is no objective truth? Well, if it is, then the statement there is no objective truth is absolutely and objectively true, and therefore we end up with a paradox. But worse than that, I know that I'm thinking about this question. You probably know that you're listening to what might be a very obscure lecture. One way or another, the existence of ourselves is something which is absolutely certain. Certain, objectively and absolutely. You can be quite confident that you are listening to another person speaking. By the time we put this together in the fact that you have toes and you are in a room or in a car or wherever you are, that you may or may not be hungry, that you may or may not be on the way to work or the way home, these are all things that are objectively true. While there are things which we believe which are wrong, or things which we believe which are not adequately justified by some form of independent testing, means that yes, there are some things that believe that are not objectively true. But the fact we might have some taste or some opinion, which in the fullness of time might be shown to be quite fanciful, That does not mean that everything that we believe has no connection to reality and absolute validity or not. We can apply this model to the question of property rights. We can quite fundamentally identify ourselves and others while we observe colours, textures and so on. From these we abstract the forms, not just the forms of the raw materials of carbon, water and minerals and so on, but we can abstract to know with certainty other people around us, also the land and other property. And so we can see the forms that are made by us and those which come from the natural world. What we can identify is that humans are the sort of creatures that have a need for life, and we need access to the raw materials of the world for our life. From this we can conclude, draw some relationships if you like, that we possess our own life. We can also conclude that life needs access to the natural world, say by way of air and water, food, shelter and so on. And our products, those things which we apply our life to, are in fact the embodiments of our own life. What that means is that if I am hungry, if I want food, I can apply a bit of my life, a bit of the time of my life, to gathering food rather than sitting under a tree and looking at the stars. In a sense, having a plate of food in front of me, I can conclude as the result of some application of my life, or at least somebody else's perhaps, to taking the raw materials that might exist as nuts and berries hanging from the trees and actually expending the labour which is required to bring them down from the trees and put them in front of a person for eating. In this way, our products, our economic production, is all organised towards presenting to human persons what their needs are to sustain life. That act of applying labour to the natural things around us in order to make life more livable means that this application means that having fruit in front of us, for example, is really an instance of where the raw materials have mixed with them human effort. And if I own my own human effort because I own my own human life, then the fact that those things exist as food on the plate owes its existence to my application of something which is naturally mine. It should be fairly evident that this really means that the products of our labour are naturally ours, because they are naturally ours to the extent that our life is ours. This conclusion that I own the products of my labour is not a convention. It's not something which my culture or my community or my time in history happens to believe. It is something which has got to do with the very nature of my existence. And to understand this further, we're going to have to explore what it is to be a human person and a few other aspects of existence. But for now, what we can say is that this relationship exists outside of the particular cultural values, beliefs or opinions that I might live within. Now, in our example of pulling the fruit off the trees, while I can see that I have a certain amount of labour added to the raw material, which is the fruit wildly growing on the trees, the fact that it's connected in some ways to raw materials which I take from the natural environment means that there's a kind of mixture of ownership. I may not own the trees that I've taken the fruit from. And if somebody else happens to own that tree, either because they have property rights arbitrarily given to them or because they've gone to a lot of trouble to grow and care for the plant over its time, then even though I've supplied the labour to get the fruit off the trees and onto the plate in front of the consumer, my title to that fruit is not absolute. I only have title to that part of the food in front of the consumer that is accounted for by my labour efforts. The actual raw material, the stuff of the fruit, is still the property rights of the owner of the tree. It turns out that the sharing of the property rights between the various causes of the food in front of the consumer becomes one of the fundamental problems of economics. But already, hopefully, you should be able to see that by applying the metaphysics of causality that we've been talking about earlier, it tends to lead us to solutions which are far more robust than simply arbitrary conventions. Before we get to that, however, we need to look a little bit further at what it is to be a person. This is largely because moral obligations only exist between persons. Wild animals, lions and tigers, do not have moral obligations to others. If I go out in the jungle and a lion eats me, it's not a bad lion, it's not a murderous lion. It is simply a lion doing what lions do, being what it is to be a lion. If lions and tigers were the sorts of creatures that were able to decide who they ate or what they ate, then the situation might be different. But if they are at that point, I would actually start to look at them as other people, as persons. This requirement for there to be free will in the other, who I have a moral obligation to, has caused people to think about what exceptions there might be. One of the first that comes up is the notion of consciousness as being the defining feature of moral persons. What that would suggest is that if I am dealing with some other who doesn't happen to have human consciousness, then I don't have a moral obligation to them. For instance, if somebody, for whatever reason, is in a coma or whatever, maybe never likely to have consciousness again, then that means that they are no longer human. It also means that people, before they first become conscious, maybe before they're born, also are not fully human, and therefore we do not have a moral obligation to them. However, the problem with this argument from consciousness is that there are many other situations where people don't exercise consciousness, but we would still consider them to be human. All of us spend 7 or 8 hours a day unconscious, sleeping. Does this mean that if someone was to jump in the window and murder us while we're asleep, they wouldn't actually be murdering us because they'd be doing no more than dealing with a non-person? Obviously, that's a little bit ridiculous. Likewise, if we have somebody who, as a result of some accident, is in a coma in hospital, to treat them as something subhuman is totally inappropriate because of the prospects of them coming out of that coma and returning to consciousness. And so the test of consciousness as a test for whether or not a creature is in fact a moral person is rather inappropriate. It's certainly limited. A second element or attribute which often is brought to bear on the moral problem is a matter of contribution. And that is the idea that people deserve to be treated in a particular way, have some kind of a moral rights as a result of their contribution to society. And this is often couched in many different ways, often with a degree of subtlety. And so we can say that somebody has made a great contribution to society, therefore they deserve perhaps an extra level of protection, an extra level of medical care. This could be contrasted to somebody who might be perceived as not especially useful to society, perhaps a very old person or a person who isn't being able to show great intellectual ability, in fact maybe no abilities at all. Is that person somebody who we shouldn't squander our precious medical resources on? When we talk like this, we're actually looking at people as not simply being people, but being more people or less people, more deserving or less deserving, on the basis of their contribution to society. This question of contribution becomes a lot more precarious when we look at the way that the future is something which is totally unknown. While we might look at somebody who has historically been a great achiever, does this mean that their contribution into the future makes it somehow necessary to go and treat them in a special way? Conversely, somebody who has not been able to contribute or show some great contribution to society in the past, maybe a poor person or something, does that mean that we treat them in a different way? Do we deny them care and so on? This question of contribution usually tends to be the line of argument which is made by people that are confident that their contribution is above the average, which means usually that they are in a position of greater political or economic power. And really the problem there is that the question of contribution as being the standard for moral obligation comes down in these cases to be a question of the powerful asserting their power over the weak. The answer to what it is to be a person comes down to human nature. And that is, human nature is that form of an animal that we're familiar with, 2 arms, 2 legs and so on, plus their life, because a dead body is not a human person. We know that human form is normally endowed with intellect and will, that is free will. So by the time we put all those together, we've got a good idea of what human nature is. But there is an important distinction that must be made, and that is that we don't actually have to have all of the potential characteristics of humanity realized in the particular person that we're dealing with. We don't have to have everybody as well developed as a weightlifter or as intellectually developed as a PhD in order to be deserving of human dignity. It is sufficient for them to merely have the potency, the potential to do these things, and whether or not that potential is likely to be realized in the concrete. What this means is that somebody, let's say, who as a result of an accident has lost their legs and will never walk again, does that mean that they're less human because they aren't an example of a complete human form, since humans have legs? Certainly not. The reason is that while they haven't got legs, their nature, their DNA, the form that they have, certainly would normally have sort of a legged creature. And the same with intellectual abilities or perhaps scientific or economic or political contributions to society. The important thing, therefore, is simply for a person to have human form which contains the potency of intellect and will. A final aspect of what it is to be human is that humans are social animals. This means that we both define ourselves but also realize ourselves. We develop as a result of our social contacts. We learn how to be a human more completely through our contacts with others. We also tend in practice to define ourselves through our relationships. Someone can draw a certain amount of pleasure from the good they do for others, and so on. Taken together, this notion of human nature is really what it is to be a person, and it makes it easy to understand why a more complete and robust understanding of the moral problem can't rest with a tribal outlook, which is to say an outlook where you consider that your own clan members are deserving of special treatment, whereas those who are outside of your particular bloodline or what have you are only worthy to be treated in a different way. Putting these ideas together, we can begin to form some robust standards of moral principles, and we'll do that with the question of justice. Aristotle defined justice as justice being to give a person their due. Let's look at how that works. We've seen that we have a right to our own life. In fact, we can't be human without life. What that means is that we cannot hold the life of another. If I own your life, it means that you and I, while both being of equal dignity as human persons, have a disproportionate relationship, because I own my life and I own your life, and you really have control of neither. Disproportion. This notion of disproportion is a very common one used in moral thought. And the idea of justice as a proportion is very, very important. We've seen this already in the notion that persons own what they make. What this means is that because I own my own life, and it cannot be taken from me, if I apply my life to some productive activity, that contribution of my life becomes my natural property because it's a part of my life. It's an embodiment of my life. It means that if I choose to sell the products of my labour, I have a right to other goods and services or whatever that are exactly conformed to the amount of labour that I've put into the thing that I sell. In this way, the notion of trade doesn't become something abhorrent or something capricious or something which is a function of a particular society or culture. It's something that ultimately has a justice element in it, which is as fundamental as one's ownership in one's own life. What I'm saying here is that the ultimate standard in trade comes down to respecting the person's right to their own life. Let's look at an example to illustrate that. Let's consider two families. Elias's family owns an island, a fairly large island. However, they choose to only cultivate 5 hectares of it, because that is about as much as they're able to cultivate given their labour resources. As a result of their efforts, we'll assume that they're able to produce about 3 tonnes of products annually, those things that they need to feed, clothe and shelter themselves. Of that 3 tonnes of product, they only consume 1 tonne per annum in order to live comfortably. When we look at the second family, we'll call them Thomas's family. That family has escaped from their own island where it sank beneath the sea as a result of a volcanic eruption or of an earthquake. Thomas's family now lives on Elias's island and also cultivates about 5 hectares, which is all they have the labour to work on. The arrangement they have for living on somebody else's island is that they pay rent. In this case, they pay rent of 1.5 tonnes of product per annum. At this point, what we can do is just sit back and look at what the relations are. Elias's family is able to do their production and live with a certain excess, and so it's likely that they would be quite comfortable and, shall we say, wealthy. That's not a bad thing. Thomas's family is producing their 3 tonnes of produce per annum. They're able to live comfortably on their 1 tonne, and in a way that 1 tonne of consumption represents the support of their life. The 1.5 tonnes of produce that they deliver up to Elias annually as rent does not affect the quality of their life. In fact, they're able to live quite comfortably and, in fact, to have savings besides. And so in this situation, the two families are able to live quite amicably on the island and prosper. However, let's look at the situation where the island experiences a drought, which happens to halve the productivity. The question I'd like you to contemplate is whether it is still just for Elias's family to demand the same rent. Now, this example has many parallels in Western practice. By and large, a landlord sets the rent quite independent of the particular productivity of their tenants, and so if they have a good year or a bad year, that's a risk that the tenants have to live with. And so it's something that we would consider to be quite normal, to continue to pay the rental value of the land on the island, the 5 hectares that they occupy, because that just happens to be the market rent. However, when we look closely, we see that if Thomas's family was producing the 3 tonnes of product annually before the drought, and now the productivity is halved, which means that their total production is only about 1.5 tonnes. If they pay the rent, where does that leave their life? What it would suggest is that if Elias's family was to demand the same rent, that is the 1.5 tonnes, it would completely consume the productive output of Thomas's family, leaving them nothing for their own subsistence. In other words, they would be left in a situation where they'd be farming all year, applying their labour to their efforts. But in this case, they would have nothing coming out of it, no support for that time that they've spent. They would simply die. We could say that if Thomas's family had been prudent, they would have been saving their half-ton a year back in history, and therefore they'd be able to afford to continue to pay the 1.5 tons, especially if we were confident that the drought was only going to be a short-term thing, that wasn't going to completely exhaust their savings. And certainly this would be nice if it happens. But one way or another, if we look closely at this, especially if the drought was to continue over a long period of time, it does come to the realisation that the property rights held by Elias's family had the capacity to take the life of Thomas's family, simply because it leaves them with a lot of labour, but absolutely no sustenance. And in this way, the property rights has the capacity to absorb or take the natural property rights of labour, which in this case Thomas's family owns. When Aristotle looked at problems such as this, he concluded that property rights tend to be conventional rights. They are rights which are simply organised and accepted by social groups, such as Elias's ownership of the island. Unlike the food that Elias's family has grown as a result of the labour of their own efforts, the island itself is something they simply happen to have. And the fact that Thomas's family arbitrarily finds itself without an island, without land resources, means that their situation as being landless is also largely conventional, because their human needs for access to property are no different to Elias's. And this creates a tension in the understanding of property rights. But what we can see, though, is that from our understanding of what it is to be human follows certain conclusions regarding the allocation of property rights and the way they find themselves into what's known as distributive justice. If Elias's family continues to charge the 1.5 tons of produce, what they're effectively doing is taking the natural property of Thomas's family away from them, which is their labour. And that naturally is an injustice. This is regardless of what the customary practices are or the laws of the land or what have you. These are things which offend the natural property rights that in this case Thomas's family have in their labour. In this way, what we're able to see is that property rights have a metaphysical foundation, and they have a metaphysical foundation in the natures of the human persons involved, and also in the causal construction of products and the fruits of people's labour. Let's move now and look at another related moral issue. We're going to look at the question of honesty. We're going to see if we can find a metaphysically robust explanation for why honesty is right and dishonesty is wrong. We'll do that by looking at this whole question of knowledge. Let's imagine that I look out on a tree and I see that it has 3 apples. That observation of mine, that perception, means that the form of the tree with the 3 apples, in somehow is represented as a formal understanding in my mind. I now have an understanding of the tree as having the 3 apples. The fact that the tree really does have 3 apples, and my idea of the tree is that it does the 3 apples, means that there is a kind of equality, a proportion between the formal reality of the tree in its concrete form and the form of the tree which is in my mind, much the same way as when the architect conceptualizes the house. There's the formal idea of the house, which is then projected out into the material world. Here the process is going in the opposite direction. But overall, the important issue here is the equality. Now let's imagine that I then walk away from the tree and I meet you. And I say to you, the tree has 3 apples. What has happened there is that I have related to another being with intellect and will, another being equal to me in human dignity. And through what I have spoken, I have communicated to you an accurate understanding of the form that I've perceived in reality. I say the tree has 3 apples. You now have the idea of the 3 apples in your mind. And so there's a proportion between us, because we are both fundamentally creatures of equal human dignity, and our understanding, our ideas, if you like, are both equal. I understand 3 apples in the tree, you understand 3 apples in the tree. What we can conclude there is that at a metaphysical level, a proportionality has been maintained. However, that proportionality breaks down if you or I see a third person and we choose to say to them, the tree has no apples. What this means is that this third person, who has equal dignity to you and I, now has an idea in their mind of a barren tree. That idea is not conformed to reality. It's not proportionate to reality, and it's not proportionate to the understanding that you and I have. That is telling a lie. And the immorality of it, its evil, its vice, if you like, comes down not because I live in a society which happens to tell everybody to tell the truth. It comes from the fact that I have created, through my own free will, a disproportion between these equal human moral actors. This question of truth-telling is fairly complex, especially in a world which is preoccupied with trying to find excuses for where we can tell lies, especially in our business life. A common counterposition that is often spoken about is, what in the case where, by telling the truth, I cause some evil to happen? Let's say there's some murderous individual coming chasing a good friend of mine who I've hidden under the bed. Do I have an obligation to communicate to this murderous invader the location of their victim? Well, the answer is that I actually don't have an obligation to tell them where the person is. However, that doesn't mean that I am then freed to tell them a lie. The reality is I don't actually have an obligation to say anything. I can let them find out for themselves. And in extreme cases, I may be also permitted to say something which in itself is true that may be likely to throw them off the scent. You have to be very delicate with the application of this. It's referred to as a mental reservation, and it relates to those situations where I tell the truth, but in such a way that it causes my listener to draw a conclusion which may lead them away from some truth. However, their conclusion is their concern, not mine. The use of mental reservations is a rather delicate moral matter that we won't go into too far here. But the important thing is to point out that while I must tell the truth because of this metaphysical proportion that is created, or disproportion when I tell a lie, I don't have an obligation to tell the truth always. There are some cases where I can either be quiet or I can tell some truth, which just happens to be such that it creates the outcome that I consider to be most appropriate. For example, in the case of where my friend is hiding under the bed and my invader comes along and says, "Have you seen this fellow?" I can answer quite honestly that I haven't seen him lately. And that might be because I sent him to hide under the bed a couple of hours ago. And for me, I consider that recent means anywhere in the last half hour or so. However, we don't have time to explore this question in great depth more than simply introduce it conceptually.